So I guess to go ahead and start things out, would you mind introducing yourself to the audience and letting them know what you do and what your field of study is?
Okay. My name is Dr. James McClintock. I'm the professor of polar and marine biology here at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And my expertise is in the area of marine invertebrate zoology in general. I study how marine invertebrates make a living, what they feed on, how they reproduce, and also how they use toxic chemicals to protect themselves from predators and different types of organisms that might want to encroach on their space. I also have an emphasis in my research of late on climate change and the impacts of climate change on marine invertebrates.
And so speaking of climate change, looking at jellyfish like this freshwater jellyfish that we've been looking at today, you've spoken before about how jellyfish have shown a sort of resilience to climate change. Could you talk a little bit about that and what kind of current research there is to support that theory?
Yeah, marine biologists noticed probably within the last, I would say 10 or 15 years, that marine jellyfish, the ones that are found in oceans, have really exploded in their population numbers. Here in the Gulf of Mexico off the coast of Alabama, the moon jellyfish comes to mind. It's a very common jellyfish about the size of a frisbee with 4 big gonads on top. You can easily tell the species. We have had some absolutely huge blooms. In fact, I was out on a boat just off of Mobile Bay, and you'd look down in the water and you just couldn't count them. They were that abundant. So what we're seeing with jellyfish is it seems that as the seas are warming, they actually are doing very well. And that's a little bit concerning because jellyfish are very, very voracious predators of plankton. And they're competing for these little organisms that fish are eating and other types of organisms are eating. So there is the potential that with large blooms of jellyfish, you could actually have some negative effects on some of the fish species and things like that. But I think the general consensus is that things that are made of jelly-like material are going to do very well in a warming world, which could be good if you happen to like to eat jellyfish.
Not exactly my cup of tea, I don't think. But...
Yes, but they are farmed, and farmed in the sense of they go out in the sea with big nets. They capture jellyfish. Jellyfish are dried. You can buy them in an Asian market here in Birmingham. I remember one of my students bringing in some dried jellyfish that we could try in class one day. So there actually are countries that eat jellyfish.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So I guess looking at this sort of resilience of jellyfish to this climate change, where is future research going looking into this? What can we learn from these jellyfish?
Well, I think what you're seeing is that there is an emphasis on studying jellyfish. It's increased since climate change has come on the scene. The biologists that study the jellyfish in regard to climate change would be monitoring the various environmental conditions that are changing in the ocean. Oceans are warming. The levels of ocean acidification are increasing. This is where carbon dioxide from fossil fuels is absorbed by the ocean, causing the ocean to become more acidic. Some species seem to have trouble with that increased acidity. So I would surmise that jellyfish don't appear to have as much trouble as other invertebrates, perhaps particularly the ones that make shells and things that are susceptible to dissolving with ocean acidification. So they're studying the effects of environmental changes, temperature, ocean acidification. They're doing population studies. It's one thing to say there's a lot of jellyfish out there, it's another to actually go out and document that this is happening. So you have to, you may use various methods to count the numbers of jellyfish there are per, square kilometer of sea or something like this. So population ecology, environmental physiology, taking the jellyfish into the laboratory, those that are, that you can culture in the laboratory, and putting them under controlled conditions that mimic the future of climate change. Increased temperatures in the tanks, you can actually bubble CO2 through water to simulate the future of CO2 and seawater as we add more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So you can do controlled jellyfish experiments. There are some jellyfish, not all of them, but there are some that have symbionts that live in their tissues and they actually need sunlight in order to photosynthesize. These little symbionts are like little plants, and the jellyfish get energy from their symbionts. And how is climate change going to affect that relationship? That would be another study that could be done. So there's lots of interesting stuff that can be done with jellyfish as it relates to climate change.
There certainly seem like a wide range of possibilities for future research, for sure.
Absolutely.
And I guess you've spoken primarily about looking at marine jellyfish, since most of the issue is around rising ocean temperatures.
Right.
I do know that freshwater jellyfish like these are susceptible to environmental factors very similar, like
Absolutely.
Differing water temperatures, alkalinity of the water, calcium carbonate concentration. Do you see any routes for future research that would be done with freshwater jellies as opposed to marine?
Yeah, I think you could apply the same logic, just as you pointed out very nicely with freshwater jellyfish, looking at things like temperature and alkalinity. I would add that environmental perturbations of freshwater systems, such as pollutants that get into ponds and lakes and streams from industry, are something that the freshwater jellyfish would lend themselves to very nicely as well. And you know, there's ways to measure jellyfish responses to environmental variables. I mean, what is one thing that a jellyfish does? A jellyfish sits there and goes like this, right? They're pulsating, they're swimming. So you can actually measure their behavioral response to an environmental perturbation by looking at the beat frequency, how often they're pulsating, and these kinds of things. And then jellyfish like the one that you described in the freshwater system, that particular jellyfish has a wonderful life cycle. They actually are not always jellyfish swimming around in the water. They release eggs and sperm into the water that are fertilized into a little larva. It's called a planula larva, and it's got cilia on it. It swims around for a while, and eventually it settles to the bottom and becomes what we call a little polyp. It kind of looks like a little palm tree sitting on the seafloor. And then it undergoes the most amazing process where it's like the top of the palm tree grows lots of little additional fronds on top of it, and they just pop off like little tiny jellyfish coming off the polyp. And then another one pops off and swims up. And these tiny little baby jellyfish then will eventually mature into full-grown juvenile and then adult jellyfish. So they have a whole life phase that involves being up in the water and also attached to the bottom. That process where they break off and bud is called strobolization, which I love. I love that word, strobolization. So anyway, a fascinating life cycle, and that means that climate change, you might study the adult and see one effect, but when you study the larvae, the planula larva or the little polyp on the seafloor, you may find that they're more sensitive to environmental perturbation than the adult is. So it's important in studies of climate change to not look at one period of the life, but also when they're larvae and when they're juveniles and adults as well. And that freshwater jellyfish would be perfect for that.
You know, I think you've put it very well in our conversation here about why it's important to study jellyfish in the realm of looking at climate change. Now, I know some of our viewers might be a little bit more skeptical in the wide range of looking at invertebrates of why is it important to study these things? You know, a lot of people are going to look at, you know, we have insects, we have these jellyfish, we have all these spineless critters out there, but what's the larger goal in studying these organisms? Like, what's the wide scale importance?
Well, I would argue that marine invertebrates, aquatic invertebrates, terrestrial invertebrates, all the invertebrates that make up 95% of the animal kingdom, are important to study because of their inherent value as a species that's part of an ecosystem. And ecosystems only hold together as well as all their components do. So, you know, I was reading the other day that insect populations around the world have been plummeting with climate change, and that this represents a tremendous risk to us as humans because they are the glue of ecosystems. Think about like bees pollinating plants. This is absolutely critical. So they're very important in ecology, but then there are some more practical applications of invertebrates, and I'll give you a case in point. Our studies in Antarctica of the chemicals that are produced by things like sponges and soft corals, which are related to jellyfish. starfish, sea urchins, all these animals that we've studied in Antarctica, many of them produce toxic chemicals that it turns out have activity against things like cancer, MRSA, the bacteria that you go to the hospital now and get, and it can't be treated with antibiotics. We just had a compound in an Antarctic sponge that's active against MRSA. It's very exciting. So I would argue that marine invertebrates and aquatic invertebrates and terrestrial invertebrates offer tremendous resources in terms of their potential for drug discovery over probably centuries to come.
I guess it's really amazing to think about. You can be setting out to find out one thing and study one thing, and you might discover a whole other wealth of knowledge along the way.
What you have just described is the true value of what we call basic research. So often, people will do applied research where they have a specific thing that they're focused on. In basic research, you're trying to understand fundamental questions of how an organism functions, how it's important in ecology. So here we are doing ecology, and we stumble upon a chemical that is not only important in the ecology of the animal, as preventing something from eating the sponge, for example, but could cure cancer or could be important in fighting bacterial infections. So you're right, it is. It's very serendipitous, and this is sort of my pet peeve as a scientist, is that society needs to continue to fund aggressively basic research, because that's where we really have found some wonderful discoveries that are very important and have very applied kinds of consequences.
If you wanted our viewers to take away one thing from what you've said about the importance of jellyfish and the importance of invertebrates in general, summarized in a couple sentences, what would you want to really send home and make sure that everybody remembers?
Well, to get back to your jellyfish theme, I would argue that because jellyfish seem to have some resilience against climate change, that they're a very important organism to study, to try to understand what it is about their biology or their ecology that makes them successful with increasingly severe environmental perturbation occurring. So that's very important. And then the fact that jellyfish are good cnidarians. They belong to the phylum Cnidaria, which of course are related to corals, which are related to the soft corals, which we've found have compounds in them that are active against human disease. So there may be something very important yet to find from jellyfish that's very important for humankind. So that's what I would say.